So again, we're going through what is called the head, because Keser generally is described as a Rosh. And then we're going through different subcomponents of the celestial head and how we apply it to our head to connect ourselves to Keser and the different influences that come down from Keser. So we talked about the Machshava, we talked about the Meitzach, the forehead, and the third one is the ears, right? The ears, the celestial ears, the ears of Keser, which is really a spiritual idea, that Oznav notos tamid lishmoa tov. That, the old saying, hear no evil, see no evil, do no evil. There is a concept of hearing no evil. Now, once again, there's a little bit of an ambiguity. You tell it, let's say the phrase, even in English, hear no evil. What does it mean to hear no evil? So it's going to be a similar type of ambiguity we discussed earlier. On one hand, there actually is a halacha, that the same way that you're not allowed to speak Lashon Hara, you're not allowed really to listen to Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is derogatory speech that involves words of humiliation about a person, something negative about a person. And people commonly say, oh, it's true. But that's obviously a very foolish statement, because the very definition of Lashon Hara is the isser of saying derogatory things about people, even if it is true. Because if it's not true, it's motzi shemra, it's sheker, that's even worse. If it is true, that is called Lashon Hara. In many ways, by the way, Lashon Hara is worse than motzi shemra. I'll tell you why. Because motzi shemra, you might be able to undo. Let's assume I said something bad about you that was totally false. In theory, maybe in theory, not always in practice, I can undo that by just telling people, I lied, I made a mistake, it wasn't true. And even though it's often the case that the false statement is on page 1 of the newspaper and the retraction is on page 51 in small print, and it is very, very hard to take something away, but at least in theory, it is easier to revoke a lie than it is to revoke the truth. Because let's just say that instead of saying something false about you that was derogatory, I said something true about you that was derogatory. Now, how am I supposed to do tshuva on that? What am I supposed to say? He says, I'm really sorry I said Lashon Hara about you, and I'll put on the internet, I am totally in the wrong that I said something derogatory about Ruvain. But, was it true or false? If it's true, the damage cannot be taken away. In other words, a true statement is more damaging to a person than a false statement, because false statements are theoretically correctable. True statements are not. So the interesting halachic question is, could I say it was a lie even though it wasn't? Let's assume that I publicized something very derogatory or embarrassing about a person, which happened to be true. Was I over on Lashon Hara? 1,000%. I was over on Lashon Hara. I want to do tshuva, and part of the process of tshuva is you try to minimize the damage done to the person in various ways. So if it's motzi shemra, you do it by trying to inform people that you lied. If it's Lashon Hara, it was true. So here's the question. Are you allowed to lie in order to try to repair the reputation of a person who was harmed by your true Lashon Hara? Can I say, I lied, even though I didn't lie? Would there be an isser of midvar sheker tirchak, right? There's an isser in the Torah to lie. But on the other hand, there are exceptions. There are situations where it's mutter to lie, and even a mitzvah to lie. Would this be a possible idea of lying? So some poskim do matra. Some poskim say that one of the ways you can do a tikkun, a rectification, for the sin of Lashon Hara is by trying to tell people that it was a lie, even though it was true. And even though that makes you look bad, okay, that's part of your tshuva. Part of your tshuva is that you're willing to take the shame of being branded as a liar in order to minimize the damage. Others say there is no heter of sheker. And if there is no heter of sheker, then in a sense, This is what Chazal call, based on a pasuk in Koheles. It's a famous pasuk. Mu'uvas lo yuchal liskain. This is a crooked matter that cannot be fixed. Meaning there are certain things in life that you really cannot totally rectify. And therefore you got to be extra careful. It's reminiscent of the story, they say, of the Chafetz Chaim, that a person went to the Chafetz Chaim and said he was nichshal in Lashon Hara many times. How can he fix it? So the Chafetz Chaim said, I'll tell you exactly how to fix it. Get yourself a pillowcase and stuff a bunch of goose feathers in the pillowcase. So the man is thinking, wow, this is a segula somehow to get rid of Lashon Hara. He says, and stuff it very full. Go on top of a roof on a windy day. Shake out the pillows, or shake out the feathers, and all the feathers will fly. And the man is now really salivating. Wow. And then what? He says, oh yes, one final step. Go gather the feathers and put them back into the pillowcase. If you can do that, you have a tikkun for the Lashon Hara that you've done. Meaning the Chafetz Chaim is saying, it is as difficult as putting the feathers back into the pillowcase. That's how difficult it is to undo Lashon Hara. And I have to say that with the internet, this has been magnified millions and millions of times. Now you can literally have Lashon Hara that could be sent to half the world's population and the like, and very difficult to retract. I just want to point out that there already have been instances, not within the Jewish community, of people committing suicide because they were outed. If they were gay or whatever it is, they were outed on the internet. And they didn't want to be outed. They were not prepared to be outed. And they killed themselves. They took their lives. So the statement in Mishlei, Hamaves v'hachayim biyad halashon, life and death are in the hands of the tongue, actually has literal application. Words can kill. Words can give life. Okay? Now, the reason I'm bringing all this in here is because kishem that there's an iser to speak Lashon Hara, there is an iser to be makabel Lashon Hara. Now this is a bit tricky. I said before something that may not be totally accurate. What I said was, you're not allowed to speak Lashon Hara, and you're not allowed to listen to Lashon Hara. Technically, that's not the way the iser is described. It does not say you're not allowed to listen to Lashon Hara, but it says you're not allowed to accept the Lashon Hara as true. So if you were to tell me about something bad that Reuven did, I am not allowed, unless, the Chafetz Chaim has many exceptions, but I'm not allowed to accept it as true. Because it's Lashon Hara, I'm not supposed to accept derogatory information as emes without some verification. In point of fact, I may be allowed to listen if you need to unburden yourself. Meaning if you're really agitated, you need to unburden yourself. I may be allowed to listen, but I'm not allowed to totally believe it. Again, this is a very tricky halacha, because even though I don't accept it as true, but I consider it within the realm of possibility. Let's assume that you tell me Lashon Hara about a certain guy, and that he's coming to assassinate me or something. In fact, this was the story of Gedalia. Gedalia ben Achikam was told ahead of time that someone is going to assassinate him. And he didn't accept it because it was Lashon Hara, and you don't accept Lashon Hara. But the short answer is, even though you don't accept it as definitively true, you take the various precautions. You take the precautions that it might be true, right? That's the issue of Kabbalah's Lashon Hara. So, going back to the Ramak, on one level, not listening to evil can simply mean I don't listen to Lashon Hara. I don't listen to derogatory, negative speech. And in a sense, that type of emulation is simply following the halacha of not being makabel Lashon Hara, not listening to Lashon Hara and the like. But once again, I think when he says you don't listen to evil, it's much more than just not listening to derogatory speech about others, But once again, it refers to not allowing your ears, so to speak, to be exposed to that which is denigrating, that which is against Kedusha. This may refer to certain types of music. This may refer to certain types of ideas, certain types of expositions. It may even refer to the idea of not listening to people who are engaged in rants or angry rants, etc., because the anger and the hate can enter your mind, apart from Lashon Hara, and somehow have negative effects on you. We are affected by inputs, inputs, what we see, and we'll get to the eyes, of course, what we hear. They affect us in different ways. Sometimes, I'm sure you may have had the experience, sometimes you hear something that you were not aware of. And maybe it was true, maybe it's not true. But it kind of changed your life, or changed the way you looked at somebody. You never looked at somebody the same way, just because of some information that you discovered. And maybe it would have been better if you didn't have that information, because it kind of changes you in negative ways. So the Ramak is saying that you guard your ears. Now, what is the connection with Hashem? Let me just look at this here. She wasn't noticed tamid lishmoa tov. That means shema shav o hamaguna, things that are vain, wasteful, or maguna. Maguna is repulsive or ugly. Lo yikanis behem klal, should not enter your ears. Kiderech shesod ha'azana ha'el yonah ein shum tza'akas din v'lo pagam lashon hara nichnas sham. So again, it's hard to know what that means. Just as God's ear, God's hearing capacity, and the level of keser, there is nothing negative that comes in. So again, see, obviously that's not true in a total sense. God certainly hears the evil things that people do. In fact, the Torah itself explicitly uses that language. When Hashem tells Avraham that he is going to destroy Sodom, he describes this in an auditory metaphor. He says, the cry of Sodom and Amorah has come to me, therefore I'm going down to see it and check it out. Now, whatever that means exactly, what is being described, just in terms of the language, is God hears the cries of the oppressed. God hears the cries of the victim of injustice. And then God goes down to see. Now again, I understand that those psukim are very difficult to understand. God hears, and then he goes down and sees. What? God didn't see, Okay, we're not going into the anthropomorphic expressions of God. But all I'm saying is, to make a statement that God does not hear evil, that evil does not enter the ears of God, is obviously not true, because the Torah itself describes that God responds to evil, at least on some level, by hearing about it first. A second example, just to give you another example where hearing is employed, when the Torah says in Parshas Mishpatim, you should not inflict an almana v'yasom, right? Do not inflict, do not cause pain to a widow or orphans, children who don't have parents. By the way, there's a whole shaila. How long is somebody an orphan? I mean, you have an 85-year-old guy, so his parents are not alive. Okay, you have to honor him because he's old, that's true. But is he an orphan? He says, how can you talk to me that way? I'm an orphan. I mean, in the Derech HaOlam, people lose their parents eventually. In fact, it's much better to lose parents than to lose a child. So usually in the normal way that God runs the world, parents predecease their children at some point. So how long are you an orphan? Right? That's an interesting question. So basically, the concept is halachically. I don't mean to say, listen, a person loses his parents, it hurts at any age. We're not talking about that. But the halachic status of Yasaim really depends on whether he's being supported by his parents. As long as you're getting your main support from your parents, then halachically the loss of either parent gives you the status of a Yasaim. Once you are financially independent, then you're no longer a Yasaim. Okay, that's just a definition. But when the Torah says, do not oppress the almana or the yasaim, it says, because if they will be oppressed and they will cry unto me, I will hear their cry and I will exact punishment. And indeed, it's very frightening. And the Torah says that I will kill the oppressor and your wives will be widows and your children will be orphans. Of course, this pasuk only works if it's the man that's doing the oppression, but that's how the Torah describes it. That bichlal is extremely frightening. One has to pay attention to this, what the Torah says about afflicting a widow and an orphan. But I'm just using it for maybe a side point to the Ramak's point, or a kasha on the Ramak's point, that what does the Torah say? The Torah says, God says, I will listen to their cries and I will respond accordingly. So, what does the Ramak mean when he says that the sod, the secret of Hazanah Ha'elyonah, God's celestial hearing, the hearing on the level of Keser, Ein Shum Tzakastin, there is no cry of the powers of din, and there's no pagam, there is no defect of Lashon Hara that is nichnas sham, that enters there at all. So again, it ultimately goes back to the Kabbalistic idea that on the level of Keser, there is no din, meaning all punishments emanate from lower levels, Chesed and Gevurah. Within Keser, there is only Rachamim. So as a result, all of the references to God hearing about injustice and punishing it, that occurs at a lower level beyond Keser. But in Keser, there is no Ra, there is no evil that's nichnas at all. So again, we're going with the idea that things occur at lower levels that may not occur at higher levels. And therefore, here the idea is that I try in my own hearing not to be poisoned, so to speak, by negativities and the like. And again, this really goes beyond. This goes beyond the halachos of not listening to Lashon Hara. That's one set of halachos. But it also refers to attitudes. I mean, let's consider this. I mean, everybody knows that we can be influenced by negative attitudes. Right? People, are always complaining about this. They're negative. They're not invested in what they're doing. Called a downer, right? There is negative energy. Now, it's very, very tricky because on one hand, we have imperatives of chesed and friendship. Somebody is down, somebody's depressed. It's a mitzvah to be mechazik them. It's a mitzvah to give them encouragement. It's a mitzvah to build them up. You don't simply drop somebody because they have, negative attitudes. You can try to help them and be a friend, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, you got to monitor yourself not to be poisoned or dragged down by that negativity. Negativity, people say positive attitudes are contagious. Yeah, Baruch Hashem, they are. But negative attitudes might even be more contagious. And therefore, you got to be very, very careful that you don't get dragged down. So part of it is to monitor what goes into your ears, meaning people are always complaining, people are always griping, people are always seeing the negatives of things. You got to try to avoid getting too involved in that, because that's going to affect your ability to function in Avodas Hashem, and therefore we emulate Hashem's midah of hearing, which on the level of Keser, only hears, only accepts that which is good. We try to be in the same way. Yeah.
Where does one draw the line between trying to help someone and then not helping because it's a pretty good effect?
Well, it's a very difficult line to draw. I mean, the principle is actually taken from another area of halacha, and this is called the principle of chayecha kaidman. If you remember, this is a famous case in Bava Metzia. I'm sure you've heard the case. This is about two people who are lost in a desert, and there's enough water that if any one person drinks the water, they'll get to an oasis and be saved, but the other one's going to die. if they split the water, each one is going to live a little longer, but they're both going to die before they get to the oasis. In other words, let's imagine there's a 2-day water supply. The oasis is 2 days away, so one guy drinks, he gets there. If they split it, they're both going to die halfway to the oasis. Maybe a theoretical case, but this is a case. So there's a machlekes in the Gemara as to what they do with the water. One rabbi, Ben Patura, who is totally unknown. This is the only place in Shas Bavli Yerushalmi that such a person is mentioned. Says, since the Torah says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you have to love your friend as you love yourself. I got to treat everybody equally. We divide the water, and even if that means we're both going to die, so be it. I cannot prefer myself over you. By the way, some identify this mysterious Ben Patura with Jesus. So some say it actually is reflective of a Christian ethic of, split everything. Rabbi Akiva, however, says, Chayecha kaidmin, you are permitted and perhaps even obligated to put your own survival ahead of helping another person. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva actually says, if you have the water, you drink the water, because that way you will survive, even if the other person dies, as opposed to both people dying. This is a principle of Chayecha kaidmin, which actually means that in your obligation to help another person, you have to be sure that you're not going to be destroyed in that process. Among other reasons, if you're destroyed in that process, you're actually not going to help the other person. In other words, in a sense, that's going to destroy the help as well. So this is, although this principle is talking about life and death, this principle is talking about dying in the desert, it actually applies to a wide variety of issues. It applies to the issue of chavrusas sometimes. This is an issue people will face in chavrusas. Let's imagine, again, I'm not here to give any particular psak, but you have a chavrusa like who always comes late, always comes an hour late, who gripes and complains and doesn't want to learn. But you're kind of, well, if I don't learn with him, he's even going to be worse. So therefore, I got to stay with him because otherwise he might leave yeshiva, otherwise he might not become frum, otherwise he won't even learn, for a half an hour a day. So I'm going to stay with him. Well, is that the correct decision? Or do you have to make a judgment at some point? Chayecha kaidmin. My life has to have priority because I'm being dragged down so much that I'm going to lose everything that I could have tried to achieve. So obviously it's a balance because it's certainly worthwhile to sacrifice something to help another person. Okay, so I'm not saying that, looking after number one, the only thing I should care about is what's best for me. No, that's not a Jewish thing either. So certainly you give up something to help other people who are weaker than you. In fact, learning with a weaker person. In a sense, you're giving up something. You could be more challenged, but on the other hand, I make a certain sacrifice. But there is going to be a point, and it's hard to know exactly what that point is, where you're losing so much that Chayecha kaidmin, Rabbi Akiva's principle, says you got to step forward and take the initiative of cutting the rope, as difficult as that is, and you're not necessarily going to be responsible for what the other guy does by virtue of the decision that you make. So it's a very difficult question. It's a question that it reminds me a little bit of a story. Ronald Reagan, the hospital, just to give a story, was married to a woman before his last wife, before Nancy Reagan, and the woman was an actress. I don't want to mention her name. And when he said he wanted to get divorced, she said to him, "If you divorce me, I will commit suicide." Now, Lamaisa, she didn't, so okay. But interesting question. To what degree can people make demands on me like that? Can somebody say, on one hand, pikuach nefesh, I got to save a life. So, do I stay in a bad marriage because the person is threatening to kill themselves if I leave? I mean, can they demand that? It's not like a one-time thing. It's not like, I'm jumping into the water to rescue them. It's basically saying, you got to be with me for the next 50 years, because otherwise I'm going to kill myself. Do you see my point here? I know perhaps I'm wandering around here. My point is that your chiyuvim towards other people at some point terminate when it really destroys your life. That's the principle of chayecha kaidmin. That if by splitting the water I'm going to die, I don't have to split the water. Now, a lot of these other cases, like the bad chavrusa, the impossible marriage, are not mamash life and death situations. But spiritually, they certainly can be. So there's going to be a hard balance, meaning when do you sacrifice and when do you say, this is needed for my self-preservation. But there is a point in halacha where we have a principle of chayecha kaidmin. Yeah.
So going back to what we were talking about lashon hara and negative speech. So does it practically mean that if someone is saying lashon hara, has said lashon hara, so even after he says it, I can prevent myself from violating that isser by just telling myself I'm not going to kabbalah it?
Yes.
Or that can also be, does that have to be verbal or has to be?
No, it's in your machshava. Now, lechatchila, you normally do not listen to lashon hara even if you're not makabel, because even if you're not over, you're causing him to be over on saying lashon hara. So you have an isser of lifnei iver leisite michshel. You see what I'm saying? In other words, there are two problems with my being makabel lashon hara. One is I'm facilitating his aveira of sipor, which makes me a transgressor of lifnei iver. The other is, if I'm makabel, I'm over on kabbalas lashon hara. Now, my machshava not to be makabel negates my aveira of kabbalas lashon hara, but it does not negate lifnei iver in being machshel and v'sipor. So lechatchila, you certainly should not even listen to lashon hara. But there, the Chafetz Chaim does say. Now he says it as a suffix, but all the poskim take this as a vadai, that if the person is very agitated and needs to relieve his anxieties, you are permitted under those circumstances to hear him, but then your kavanah is not to be makabel. But this is not an eitzah for everything. Normally you're supposed to disengage and not even listen. Yeah.
If one is in a three-way conversation and one of them is telling over lashon hara, you mentioned the heter of lying for some poskim to prevent the lashon hara. So
right.
with the third person, the listener, one of the listeners be allowed to lie or maybe tell a very, very deceptive thing to try to mitigate the lashon hara.
Yes, certainly. I think that would be permitted. If you consider sheker is permitted in order to, if you follow that view, to mitigate the detrimental effects of lashon hara, that would apply to other people who are listening to it. You can also kind of tell a lie. Yeah.
When the Rav said that motzi shema in theory may be easier because you can just say that
Yep.
you lied. Is that bidei halacha or is bidei halacha motzi shema worse?
No, as an okay, I wasn't saying motzi shema is less of a sin. Motzi shema is worse than lashon hara. But what I was saying is, in a sense, it's easier to do tshuva on it because it's easier to undo it. Now, I didn't say that's easy either, but at least potentially it's easier. How do you undo a truthful statement? In fact, there's a saying in law, in secular law, there is a tort that's called libel. Libel is when I make negative statements about you. Now, it's interesting. In secular law, if it's true, there's no liability at all. In other words, fakert. In secular law, libel is punishable only if it's false. If it's true, it's mutter. I could say whatever I want about you as long as it's true. And yet, some commentators have pointed out, the greater the truth, the greater the libel. A person's reputation is much more harmed by negative truthful information than they are harmed by negative false information, because false information can be corrected, truthful information cannot really be corrected. Of course, this gives rise to yet another machlokas, not nogay here, but I'll mention it. A famous machlokas between the Chafetz Chaim and Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. This is a very, very interesting machlokas. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter lived in the 19th century. He died like in the 1890s. So when he died, the Chafetz Chaim was a young man, relatively young man, and the Chafetz Chaim printed his first sefer, which was the Sefer Chafetz Chaim. That's why he's called the Chafetz Chaim. His first sefer was on the laws, not the Musar. The Musar came in other svarim, Shmiras Halashon. But the Sefer Chafetz Chaim is a book on the halachos of Lashon Hara. And the Chafetz Chaim, whose name was Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen, wrote the Sefer anonymously without putting his name on the book. And he basically said, based it on the pasuk, Mi ha'ish ha'chafetz chaim, who is the man who desires life? Nitzor l'shoncha meira, guard your tongue from evil. So his sefer was called Chafetz Chaim, and since the author was anonymous, people started talking about the Chafetz Chaim. So that's how he got the name Chafetz Chaim. So when Rishon Salanter got the sefer, he said, Baruch Hashem, Hashem has prepared a leader for the Jewish people, for the new generation. Someone who will teach them midos and proper behaviors. And he saw this as a great, great gift min hashamayim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu designated this anonymous gadol. Rishon Salanter didn't know where he was. But it says that Rishon Salanter went through the whole sefer very carefully, and there was one halacha in the sefer that he was cholek with. And that is, the Chafetz Chaim says, when you want to do tshuva on Lashon Hara is a sin not only against Hashem, but it's a sin against the person. Lashon Hara is bein adam lamakam and bein adam l'chaveira. Now, what is the general rule when you sin bein adam l'chaveira? Yom Kippur does not give you forgiveness till you go to the person that you harmed and you ask their mechila. And then they have to be mochel you. And only if they're mochel you, belev shalem, does Hashem forgive you. So says the Chafetz Chaim, if I spoke Lashon Hara about Ruvain, and I want to do tshuva, I gotta go to Ruvain and be mavakesh mechila. Now, if I go to Ruvain and I say, please be mochel me for whatever I did, Ruvain has the right to ask, well, what did you do? You don't have to be mochel somebody if he doesn't tell you what he did. So Ruvain says, oh, you don't want to know. You don't want to know. And he said, well, I have to know. I'm entitled to know. So the Chafetz Chaim says, then you have to tell Ruvain what you said about him. The Chafetz Chaim says, if you need Ruvain's mechila, you must be moidia Ruvain as to what you said. This is what the Chafetz Chaim says. Unless Ruvain is willing to be mochel you without asking. Rav Yisrael Salanter disagreed with that. Rav Yisrael Salanter said, if Ruvain doesn't know what you said, and you tell him what you said, you're adding pain to Ruvain. You're giving Ruvain pain and sorrow. He says, don't be a tzaddik, a famous statement, on somebody else's cheshbon. You know, when asking mechila is going to cause him more pain than he had before, the Torah paters you from asking mechila. In other words, the halacha of asking mechila no longer applies under those circumstances. And then you pray to Hashem that you should be forgiven. So this is Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's big yesod, that you don't ask mechila if in the process of asking mechila you're going to cause more pain. Because that's almost selfish. I want my mechila, so I'm going to, hurt you more to get my mechila. So this was the one halacha that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter disagreed with the Chafetz Chaim. So you ask me, well, how do we paskin? What's the halacha? Well, obviously, I cannot be machriya between the Chafetz Chaim and Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, but it is said in the name of Rav Aaron Kotler that the tradition in Europe was, the Masorah in Europe was, that in all of the laws, bein adam lechaveiro, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was considered to be the definitive posek acharon, even keneged the Chafetz Chaim, who was younger. And therefore, he said the minhag was, or the established halacha was, you're not mavakesh mechila, where that's going to cause pain. Or you're mavakesh in a general way. But then, of course, you get the problem. If the guy says, well, what did you say, then you're in trouble. But it's, assuming he'll accept a general mechila, or a general request for mechila, you can do it that way. Otherwise, don't do it at all. Right? So this is an interesting issue. However, I do want to add, I think you may have to qualify this a little bit more. And that is, Rabbi Salanter is talking about unknown things. I go over to you and I tell you something you didn't know that I said, and it's really going to hurt you. But the truth of the matter is, the issue of bakashas mechila causing pain can even be with known things. I mean, let's assume I did something to you that was really, really, really bad, and you were humiliated and embarrassed. But you put it behind you. You don't think about it anymore. And I come and I bring it up. So it's not that I'm telling you something you didn't know, but I'm still bringing back painful experiences that you would rather not get involved in. That's a little bit of a different situation, and I'll tell you why. Because there, the short-term pain could actually lead to a greater reconciliation. Meaning, the fact that when I initially remind you of this, it hurts you, but upon further reflection, it might bring you to a better place. See, unlike the unknown Lashon Hara, where you're fine now, so why should I give you any type of discomfort? So it could very well be that even if something is a temporary pain, a temporary dislocation, that may be mutter to be mevakesh mechila, because there's a good possibility it'll lead to something better. But if it's stamazai introducing pain that was unknown to the person, Rabbi Salanter says it is better not to even bring those things up. Okay, but B'kitzur, all of this is nichlal in your shemiya is very, very important, because once again, you see, our thoughts and our emotions are formed, or at least there are contributing factors based on our sensory inputs. So what we hear affects us, and the next thing it will be what we see affects us. And therefore one has to be careful as to what they hear and what they see. Okay, we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.